Hello, everyone, and welcome to the History of World Religions. And I am your professor, Dr. Gabriel Selassie. Today, what we're going to be talking about is the evolutionary origins of religion. So I'm going to go ahead and key up the presentation so we can just delve right in and get started. This presentation will probably take, I'm saying maybe about 45 minutes or so. I'll try to push through it, but some of the concepts here we're going to need for later exploration into, particularly when we get to Ernest Becker. So I'm going to try to push the envelope here, so to speak, but nevertheless, some of the things that we'll have to talk about in earnest. So take out your paper and your pens and get ready to take some notes here. So what we mean by the evolutionary origins of religion is we're talking about how religion in and of itself evolved with the evolution of the human species. There are probably no animals that practice any form of religion. I mean, for one, I don't think I've ever seen an animal that, say, raise a cross or in the concept of praying. But since we just don't have any idea about many of these sentient beings, so to speak, it's hard to say, but we're probably on fairly safe grounds. But we know that human beings do in fact practice religions, ergo why we have courses on religions. So then the major question that comes to us is, why religion? Why do human beings spend an inordinate amount of time building churches, taking a good inordinate amount of time, sometimes an hour, sometimes 4, 5, 6 hours? In some churches, like charismatic Pentecostal churches, they spend half a day, if not a full day, in church. So why do human beings engage in this kind of behavior? Now, one of the ways that we can try to answer this question is by looking at primates, because they are our ancestors, or they share a common ancestor, which makes them pretty much akin to our cousins. And we go back as far back as about 4 to 6 million years where we did in fact have that ancestor. And from that particular time period, we can understand that there has been a lot of adaptation for human beings and that sort of thing, because Homo sapiens only came into the human record about 200,000 years ago. So you can see just by looking at these pictures here that there is some direct correlation with the species, the primates. And of course, there are a number of different kinds of primates, everything from bonobos to chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, gibbons, etc. And we know that human beings in many ways are like these primates, because one of the things that I learned, especially being in the military, is the ability to climb, right? And so we use our hands and feet and etc. to climb, and we're pretty good at doing that. So we can look at this chart here and we can see that human beings do share some common ancestor, and of course those ancestors had broken off from human beings. You can see the hominini, and then the pan, and then a homine, right? The gorillini, and the hominidia ends up being pogoats and hybelates, etc. So from this, we gathered that there are some human characteristics. But then the question evolves around, if we do share these common traits and a common ancestor, then why is it that primates then don't share in profligating this idea of religion? And that is a fascinating question. Before we get into that, we can just say, for our example, just if you're curious, right, the chonoflagates here are the ancestors of all animals going back, millions and millions of years ago. Now, we know that primates are not religious, but they do share some traits necessary for the evolution of religion. For one, primates are really sophisticated creatures. They're highly intelligent. For example, you can look at primates, for example, who will eat ants, and in order to get the ants out, they have to figure out devices to do that. And so then if you've watched any of the Jane Goodall movies or documentaries, what have you, you'll see these primates will take tools, they'll build tools, they'll get sticks and strip them down, push them down into a hole, and then put out the ants and eat them, right? That is highly capable intelligence. They also have the capacity for symbolic communication. We know that the communication is not ultimately sophisticated communication for our purposes, right? For one, I've never seen two groups of chimpanzees battling each other and then one of them raising up a white flag. Never seen that. That would be really sophisticated and highly advanced and intelligent communication. But nevertheless, we do know that they are able to communicate with each other at some basic level. And we also know that they have some sense of social norms. They, generally speaking, gather in societies and groups, and they can distinguish one from another. They know who the leaders are and who are the followers, etc. They hunt together. They do all sorts of things, and they have a really unique understanding of the self. And what I mean by that is that they know exactly who they are. And we can see how this plays out in some respects during death. For example, there is the Jane Goodall film where there is one of the primates who realizes that one of them's dead and goes over and tries to get the child back moving again. And of course, that doesn't happen, and they realize that life has gone out and they move on, right? So they know that life is within themselves and life can be, in fact, extinguished. They also have this concept of continuity, which does fit into this whole idea of the self and the idea of perpetuation of the species. Now, we know that there is prehistoric evidence of religion, and we can see this because it is exhibited in ritual treatments of bodies who have been deceased. So ritual burials are evidence that suggests that prehistoric times people fundamentally understood the concept of life and death, and they understood that there was, or at least they believed that there was, some form of afterlife, because why else then would you prepare a body after death, right? So you see chimpanzees and others, when their mates and their children, etc., die, they don't prepare any rituals. They play with the body to try to get it back, as I said before, and then they move on. All animals do that. They just eventually at some point move on. Now, in some cases, elephants will mourn, but there is no, to my understanding, there's no form of burial. But with human beings, from as far back as we can go to prehistoric times, we know that there is some semblance of, or an idea or of a thought process of preparing the body for its next phase, its next step, or its next realm, or if you're a Roman, the afterlife. And we can see some of these mortuary rituals when we go back well over 160,000 years. So, for example, in Afar, Ethiopia, this is what our early ancestors would have looked like, human ancestors. And then we look at these burials and we can see flowers, and this is the yellow. We can see the body has been dyed with red ochre. So we know that the bodies have been prepared, and in some cases, when we look at the Norse, the Egyptians, the Chinese, etc., accoutrements have been attached. You will find beads, and you will find lots of funerary arrangements, chairs and tables and things that an individual might need in the afterlife. So from that perspective, we know early mankind always had a view and understood that death had meaning and that there was a afterlife or another meaning behind one's death, that there wasn't something that was final. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get to Ernest Becker, but you should just kind of underline that and keep that as a note or in the back of your mind. Now, we know that in terms of evolutionary psychology, that human beings have had a propensity to engage in human religious behavior. And so, from that standpoint, there is a lot of scientific disagreement about that on what are the exact mechanisms that drove the early scientific mind. What was the process? Did human beings just automatically come out of the womb expressing this idea of religion? Or was this a gradual process? How did it happen? All of these kinds of things are worthy of us to kind of explore in the next couple of minutes. Now, there are always, at least over the past, say, 20, 25 years, there are two schools of thought behind this evolution of religion, and they have to do with natural selection and adaptation, because from here, what there seems to be is that religion is going to confer some type of evolutionary advantage. Now, just what that evolutionary advantage is going to be is an overall different question. There are some studies that seem to suggest that people who are deeply religious are much happier. They lead much more tranquil lives. And I think that they may be on some basic level less afraid to die or meet their maker. That might be the overall suggestion. And so what would it be, or how much value can one put on the idea of equanimity or calmness when one is about to perish, right? Can you put a price tag on that, right? So that might be something where we can see where religion might have a psychological advantage, where if people lead much happier lives because they're religious, that might be the advantage. It may have this deep-seated psychological advantage. So we, from our standpoint, can believe that religion itself are byproducts of adaptive traits. And so what we mean by that is that what does religion demand of us? Well, it demands of us celibacy. We have to, as I said earlier, we have to spend time. There are, in some cases, painful rituals. There's money involved, right? So what we think is that maybe religion was born out of some other need, and over time that it may have been adapted to something else. I'm not really too sure what the answer to that is, but it's something that you should think about, and something that maybe over time all the great sages have all thought about, and that is, from your perspective, worth exploring. Now, one of the most important people to begin this inquiry into evolutionary psychology and religion was a man by the name of Stephen Jay Gould. And he came up with what we called the Gould hypothesis. It wasn't completely all of his idea, but his partner, another professor, came up with it, and I've kind of forgotten the name. But nevertheless, Stephen Jay Gould was very famous. He was a evolutionary biologist who worked at Harvard. He was a Harvard professor, and he wrote a very famous book called The Mismeasure of Man. And this was all about how pseudoscience was brought in to justify racism. And that's a really fascinating book if you're interested in that. Now, one of the things that Gould argued here was that religion was a byproduct of psychological mechanisms. And what he meant by this was a theory called exaptation. And exaptation is essentially nothing more than sort of natural selection, or Mother Nature, or whomever you want to call what has created the great ultimate mystery here. That exaptation is a trait co-opted for other than the one which natural selection has built for it. So let me see if I can rephrase that. I don't think that came out altogether too well, but let me see if I can restate it. In other words, what Gould is saying here is that we have traits that were designed by natural selection or through natural selection, and we have adapted those things for other uses. That is exaptation. probably the best example to use in explaining exaptation is feathers. So we know that dinosaurs had feathers, and we're not quite sure why they had them. Perhaps they were multicultural, and they probably, if a dinosaur could have the best sort of multicultural design, it might attract the best mates to keep the species moving through natural selection. That might have been it. But what happened is that those feathers then were turned into mechanisms for flight. So we can fully understand that, okay, you had dinosaurs on ground who couldn't fly, but eventually there were some of these dinosaurs that adapted these or co-opted these things, these feathers, and used them to get off the ground, probably to keep from being eaten. So that seems to be a rather interesting idea, and it seems reasonable to me. Now, Gould didn't give any particular specific details to this. He just basically thought that that human consciousness itself was adapted into religion, that adaptation for human consciousness is religion. So we have this human consciousness, and then eventually one of the things that we do with this human consciousness is adapt it or co-opt it for religious purposes. Okay. There is Stephen Jay Gould. Stephen Jay Gould passed away suddenly, I think, from cancer in 2002. I considered him to be just a very fascinating individual. Absolutely fascinating. Now, one of the other sort of evolutionary biologists who's weighed in on this was a man by the name of Richard Dawkins, who was a professor at Oxford. And he weighed in and said that religion is a byproduct of cognitive modules in the human brain related to reproduction and survival. So he thought that essentially religion, which is a cultural adaptation, was used as a part of or built through the natural selection process. So of all the things that human beings have created over the many millennia that we've been on this earth, one of the things that survived was, in fact, our religions. They've survived. We are a religious species. So there must be something about other forms of culture that have completely died off, sort of like bell bottoms and stacks in the 1970s, right? Those things have kind of played out. But natural selection in terms of religion has stayed. So for example, genes. Genes have been around forever as soon as they were invented. And this was probably in the somewhat maybe mid to late 19th century that they've lasted, and people still buy genes because they're durable. It's just part of our culture. They have some sort of cultural significance for us, but they survive because they have some distinct function. It's the everyday pair of pants that you can just kind of, if you don't know what else to wear, throw on, and they go with just about everything, right? So from this particular standpoint, something about religion, according to Dawkins, must be altogether important. So from this perspective, for Dawkins, the religion is like a meme. It spreads like a virus spread. And I don't mean to play light on this because of our COVID, right? But this is just exactly what he's saying. So here is Richard Dawkins. This is a younger Richard Dawkins, by the way. Next is geneticist Dean Hammer, who weighed in and said that there is a such thing called the God gene, VMAT. Now, what Dean Hammer is going to argue here is that the God gene is nothing more than a byproduct of human spirituality that is influenced by hereditary and the human experience. And so what would he be saying here? When I interpret this, I find that what Hammer is saying is that human beings actually do need to have spiritual and mystic experiences. And this, in some ways, explains why human beings are so addictive, or drugs are so addictive to the human species. And it's simply because of the fact what a lot of drugs do for people is they take one out of their body. You get to have an altogether otherly worldly experience. Things like DMT, ayahuasca, even things like cocaine or the crack form of cocaine, even ganja. Bob Marley once said that when smoking ganja, it reveals yourself to yourself. And so from that particular standpoint, we know that human beings have a innate, deep-seated need to have these otherworldly experiences. So from Hammer's point of view, spirituality can in fact be quantified, right? Because it is the gene. And this tendency towards spirituality is heritable. So we can probably make just a general conclusion here that in some likelihood that human beings can pass down their affinity for religion from one generation to the next. My parents were not religious at all. They went to church. They tried to get us to do the whole Catholic thing, and then later the Ethiopian Orthodox thing, the whole 9 yards. And so, but they themselves weren't necessarily as spiritual as the next. I think that my mother particularly was searching, and that's why she went to Ethiopia and had this great religious experience. But I think most of all, I'm not so sure if this runs very deeply in my family. But nevertheless, what I think Hammer is making the argument here is that spiritual individuals are favored by natural selection. That's probably in some small way why this is important. And there is Dean Hammer here. Next, this gives us to Robin Dunbar, who was born in 1947, and I'll show you a photo of Robin Dunbar in a minute. Now, Dunbar came up with an interesting theory that we call Dunbar's theory, and he said that when human beings evolved, they evolved with the ability to process spiritual or religious experiences, and this is with the development of the human brain's neocortex. And this occurred some 500,000 years ago as human beings were slowly evolving into the Homo sapiens sapiens that we are, or the Homo sapien rex. Here what he was arguing is that once we developed this neocortex, that we had enough, so to speak, brain power to process complex social phenomena such as language, which then helps us to express our religious feelings. There is Robin Dunbar. And so if you look on the left, we have a mouse with a very small neocortex, a monkey with a much larger but still altogether small neocortex, and then we have the human brain with the largest neocortex. So what Robin Dunbar is making the argument as the development of this massive size neocortex, then we're able to do things like process language, which then gives ourselves over to the ability to process religion, because the brain therefore can do things like have sensory perception. Religion in many ways is a very visual sort of adaptation or a process. There is spatial reasoning, right? Conscious thought and language. So the relative neocortex size within human beings can roughly be said to correlate with social complexity of the particular species. Now, there are some religions where you really don't have to have sort of social complexity, right? There are some religions that you can pretty much do on your own. But I think at some fundamental basic level, the social complexity inherent in religions are really fundamentally important, and I think lends themselves to the human species. Next is Emil Durkheim, the 19th century philosopher. And Durkheim once said that the principal forms of art seem to have been born out of religious ideas. So what we have here, according to Emil Durkheim, is that first we have this ability to process language, to process religion, and then everything else will flow out of religion, like culture, and things like art are a manifestation of that culture. Now there is Dunbar, who says religious ideas, at least are those that are shared, are born out of art, or without material symbols, they cannot be sufficiently anchored into the human mind. So on the flip side of Durkheim, Dunbar is making the expression here that religion is born out of art. So you can go back and look at, you can just Google prehistoric art, and you can see in like Lascaux, France, the cave dwellings, you could probably make the argument that the art came first and then the religion, or perhaps the art forms were created as the process of religion was created, and those caves in Lascaux were nothing more than ceremonial caves for young boys, right? That could be one of the things, or girls, that could be one of the things that is placed before us that we can think about. So what comes first? Is it the art or is it the religion? So if you believe that it's the religion, then you're predisposed to think that culture then emanates out of religion. If you believe that language and things like art, because art is an expression of language, then you would have to then argue that everything comes after that, including the culture bound up in religion itself. So there's Emil Durkheim, 1858 to 1917. So just to sort of recap this, with Durkheim, religion expressed art. With Dunbar, art is expressed to religion. Now, Dunbar is confident that the ideas about supernatural beings did not exist in people's minds before material symbols were made. This is really important, because when we get to Ernest Becker, you're going to want to sort of understand these concepts of symbolism. So with Dunbar, he's making the argument here that you could not make expressions of supernatural beings unless you could make material symbols that could in fact be the expressions of those. So how can one know God if one cannot paint God? Impossible. That's the kind of thought process here. Right? So how are people of the world to understand religion when the belief in supernatural beings violate the principles of the natural world? Think about that for a moment. So how do you, and this is very much tied into the use of symbols, how are you to understand that there is a God sitting on a puffy cloud when you know that if you were to jump out of an airplane onto a puffy cloud, you're going to fall through it? That's the valid principle. Everybody knows that Einstein and his theories of gravity, etc. So how can we then see expressions of God? And we can do this because we anchor supernatural beings in the material world through representational art. So we ground these supernatural beings that defy the principles of the natural world into worldly symbols. So the symbols themselves are anchored. So if you take the symbol of, let's say, Jesus, which is a fish, and you drop it onto the ground, it follows the principles of the natural world. But the symbol itself, the reference point, points back somewhere else. But you're able to kind of understand it by looking at the symbol that is material in your hand, that has to follow all of the principles of the natural world. So it is a trick that your brain is playing on yourself to be able to get you to appreciate the supernatural in the principles of the natural world. right? And so here are just some signs and symbols that you can see expressed. Nobody knows Ford, right? I mean, unless you work in the factory, you don't know Ford. But when you look at the symbol, you think of Henry Ford and the 100 years or so packed behind it, the engineering, everything that you can think about that's expressed in that. And some people, for example, if you say Chevy versus Ford, people will imbue it. What kind of a person drives a Chevy? What kind of a person drives a BMW? Right? So you imbue all of these things in the symbols themselves. Right? And so then we can see these symbols here for Christianity, the fish, right? Jesus is the fisher of men, right? The symbols of the crescent, the Star of David, the yin and yang, all of these kinds of symbols, right? Rokai, all of them are expressions, and we imbue them with our fundamental ideas. And we can even see these glyphs are tagged into all kinds of areas in the world. Now, the use of symbols, Carl Jung stated that symbols appear in dreams and collective unconsciousness of archetypes and that of the self. And so what do we mean by these archetypes? Archetypes are the innate tendencies that mold human conduct. So there is the archetype of the scholar. There is the archetype of the athlete. There is the archetype of the mother, right? We think of what is the prototypical old man: wise, caring, offering to give advice, a sage. What is the prototype of the mother? Nurturing. Now we know that not all mothers are nurturing. Not all older people are willing to give advice or kind. Some are crabby and old and stuffy and all that kind of stuff because they've lived through the circus, right? And they've seen the puppet show. And so they're not willing to put up with all this stuff. But we imbued with these archetypes, these types, and we call archetypes because what we mean by that is we say the head types. What is the principal type behind these, right? So what we mean by that is that these archetypes then are innate tendencies that mold human conduct. So what does the college student do? The college student studies, is reverential to his professor, her professor. The college student is always on time, gets things done, is in the library until it closes. These are the archetypes. And we hold out these archetypes as symbolic of what that type will be. Now, what we do then, according to Jung, is that we imbued in these archetypes, right? And we have these and they appear in our dreams. And what we mean by the collective unconsciousness is that human beings all over the world share these similar archetypes. They don't change. If you go to China and ask a person, what is a great student? They will tell you the same things. They study, they're in the library, they reverent to their professors, and et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't change anywhere. We have these same archetypes. You go to a remote village in Asia or Africa and ask somebody, what is the old man? And they'll say, a person who gives wisdom. These archetypes never change. And there's Carl Jung. Now, organized religion then comes going back about 11,000 years old in the Near East, or 11,000 years ago in the Near East. And this came about through the development of organized society. So the archaic world comes where human beings shift from having a protein-based diet to a much broader diet where they are now eating plants, plant life, essentially. So they're growing crops, sorghum and oats and beans and all sorts of things. So they don't have to follow herds any longer. They can go out and, say, kill an animal and eat the animal. And then once the animal is all eaten, they can survive for weeks on the agricultural products they have produced. So they no longer have to keep following the buffalo, the herds. So with that becomes sedentary life, and then you're able to then build a much, much more complex society. A hunter-gatherer society, I would argue, is a simple society. Then we moved into this archaic world where we're eating a much richer diet of plants and animals. We then move to a much more complex society. And so then we can have, within that complex society, we can do all kinds of things. For example, we can educate ourselves, build universities, build schools, develop bureaucracies, build government, build militaries, tax collectors, and we can do all kinds of things. And one of the things that we can do is we can use religion to help solidify bonds. We can use religion as a moralizing force. People don't want to act up or act right, so what we do is we have the 10 Commandments. These are the things that have been ordained by God. And to disobey these things, for one, is to run afoul of the community, but also to run afoul by God. So with this building of these complex societies, since we already have the propensity for religion, then we can just take this religion and it helps us then to organize society. Okay, so let's try to see if we can summarize here. So we can say that religion may be a byproduct of evolution, and that there might be some cognitive relationship between art and science, language, which will help develop culture, and that imbued in our now societies are these signs and symbols. And so we can build a much, much more complex society around our religious beliefs. If you're interested in delving a little bit more into this, you can look at the Oxford Handbook of Evolutionary Psychology by Dunbar and Durkheim, 2007. All right, that's it for this lecture. If you need to review the notes, make sure you get the PDF lecture slides and prepare yourself for the next lecture.